Picture this, a bridge cracking apart under fire and shadow, an old man in gray robes standing completely alone, blocking the path of something older than the sun itself. Most people think that moment is the peak of what Gandalf is capable of. It's not even close. What you've seen on screen, what you remember from the movies, is a small fraction of what this character actually is, and what he can actually do. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what Gandalf is made of underneath that old man disguise, where his power genuinely comes from, every single form that power takes across the entire story, and why some of his abilities are frightening enough that even Sauron himself avoided facing him directly. Let's get into it. Immortal Spirit. Let's start with the one fact almost everyone gets wrong. Gandalf was never human. He was never really born in any sense you'd recognize. Before Middle-earth existed, before there was a sun or a moon, before there were elves or men walking anywhere, there were spirits called the Aenir, shaped directly from the thought of Ilúvatar, the one being who created everything. Among the lesser members of that group, a class of spirit called the Maiar, there was one named Olorin. Olorin lived in Valinor, the Undying Lands across the Western Sea, and he served in the household of the Vala Manwe and his wife Varda. He also spent time learning from Nienna, a being associated with grief, patience, and pity, and that connection matters a lot later. According to Tolkien's own notes, Olorin used to walk among the elves of Valinor unseen, quietly whispering wisdom and hope into their hearts, never taking credit for it. When the shadow of Sauron began rising again during the Third Age, the ruling powers of the world, the Valar, made a decision. They chose 5 of their own kind and sent them into Middle-earth disguised as old men, forbidden from ruling through force or overwhelming the free peoples with raw power. They were meant to guide, not command. This order became known as the Istari, the Wizards. Olorin was the last one selected for the mission, and by most accounts, the wisest. He also openly admitted he was afraid to go, specifically because he feared Sauron. He was the only one of the Istari who expressed that fear out loud, and the Valar sent him anyway, because that fear was actually seen as a sign of wisdom. Once he arrived in Middle-earth, the men and dwarves who met him gave him a new name, Gandalf. Here's the important part, because Gandalf is a Maia, a spirit, he isn't alive the way a mortal is. He put on the shape and appearance of an old man, but that shape is essentially a costume over something ancient and non-physical. His body can absolutely be destroyed. What can't be destroyed that easily is him. This gets directly proven in the story itself. When his body dies during a battle deep underground, he doesn't actually cease to exist. He comes back. Not as a ghost, not as a reincarnation, but as the same spirit sent back into the world to finish a job that wasn't done yet. It also helps to compare him to the other members of his own order. 5 Istari were sent into Middle-earth altogether. 2 of them, referred to only as the Blue Wizards, traveled east and effectively vanished from the main story. One, Radagast, grew so absorbed in animals and nature that he drifted away from the larger mission entirely. Saruman, originally the head of the order and the wisest by reputation, ended up seduced by the idea of power for its own sake. Out of all 5 spirits sent on the exact same task, Gandalf was the only one who stayed focused on the actual job the entire time, refused every opportunity to grab power for himself, and it's worth noticing that he's also the only one the Valar considered worth sending back after death. That's not a coincidence, it's a direct reflection of who he was underneath the disguise the whole time. But if death itself couldn't hold him, then what actually happened in that fight? And more specifically, what was the fire he called on right before he fell? That's where things start getting genuinely interesting. The Secret Fire. There's a single line Gandalf says on that bridge, right before he falls, that gets quoted constantly without most people understanding what it actually means. Standing against a demon of fire and shadow, exhausted, he tells it, "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor." Then he adds, "The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun." This isn't a boast about magical firepower, it's a declaration of allegiance. And to understand why it lands so hard, you need to know what the secret fire actually is according to the deeper lore. Before anything existed, before even the Aenir began singing the world into being, Iluvatar held something called the Flame Imperishable, also referred to as the Secret Fire. This is the thing that makes existence real rather than just imagined. When Iluvatar speaks something into true being, it's the secret fire that gives it actual life instead of leaving it as a vision or an idea. Melkor, the first and greatest of the Dark Powers, later known as Morgoth, searched endlessly through the emptiness of the void hoping to find that fire for himself, hoping to gain the power of true creation. He never found it, because it exists with Iluvatar alone and nowhere else. So when Gandalf calls himself a servant of that fire, he's stating exactly where his authority comes from. He's not claiming to be the strongest thing on that bridge, he's claiming to represent something the creature in front of him can never actually possess. And then there's the second half of that line, the Flame of Anor. Anor is one of the old names for the sun, but there's also a very literal physical connection here that a lot of people miss. When Gandalf first arrived on the shores of Middle-earth, a shipbuilder named Círdan met him at the harbor and, sensing something in him, secretly gave him one of the 3 rings made for the elves. This one was called Narya, the Ring of Fire. Círdan told him plainly that this ring would help him kindle hearts that had grown cold, and give him strength against the weariness of the long fight ahead. Narya isn't a ring that shoots fireballs, its power is quieter than that. It works on courage, on hope, on the will to keep resisting when everything looks hopeless. So when Gandalf says Flame of Anor, there's a real object on his hand backing up the metaphor. Standing across from him on that bridge is a creature that calls itself the Wielder of the Flame of Udun, fire pulled from the ancient pits of Melkor's ruined stronghold. It's fire, technically, but it's a stolen, corrupted echo of the real thing. 2 kinds of flame meeting on the same narrow bridge. One tied to creation itself, one tied to destruction and theft. That contrast is the entire scene in a single sentence. It's also worth pointing out what this creature actually is, because it isn't some random monster invented to give Gandalf an obstacle, it's a Balrog, one of the surviving Maiar who followed Melkor into corruption back in the earliest age of the world, driven underground and buried for thousands of years after the war that shaped the continent. In other words, the 2 beings fighting on that bridge are the exact same kind of creature, from the exact same original order of spirits, having ended up on opposite sides of the same ancient conflict. That's part of why the confrontation carries so much weight. It isn't a wizard fighting a monster, it's one servant of Iluvatar's fire meeting one servant of a stolen fire, setting something that's been building since long before either of them ever set foot in Middle-earth. Now, understanding where that fire genuinely comes from also explains something people usually get backwards about what happens to Gandalf next. His return from death wasn't really a simple resurrection into a stronger version of himself, it's actually a lot stranger than that, and we'll get into exactly what happened in a minute. Quick pause here though, if this is the kind of deep dive you're into, hit subscribe, because we go this deep on Middle-earth lore regularly. Now let's get to the next power. Unveiled power. The name Gandalf the White gets thrown around a lot, usually as if it just means he got a costume upgrade. That's not what happened. What actually changed was how much of his real power he was allowed to use. Remember, the Istari were deliberately bound into old, physical, limited bodies specifically to stop them from overwhelming the people they were sent to help. That was the entire point. Sauron ruled through domination and fear. The wizards were sent to do the opposite, to counsel and encourage rather than command. Gandalf accepted that limitation the entire time he wore the gray robes. After a battle that dragged on for days through the depths of a mine and up the side of a mountain called Zirak-Zigil, Gandalf's physical body finally gave out and died. What happened next is described in strange, almost otherworldly terms. He talks about being sent back for a brief time until his task is done, and about wandering outside of time itself before that happened, following paths that even some of the higher powers of the world don't fully know. When he returns, he comes back as Gandalf the White, and the restrictions placed on him at the start of his mission seem to have been loosened, because the stakes had gotten far more serious. You can see the difference immediately in what he starts doing. At Edoras, the capital of Rohan, King Theoden has fallen under the influence of Saruman, working through his advisor Grima Wormtongue, and the king has become weak, aged beyond his years, practically paralyzed. Gandalf walks in and essentially breaks that hold on the king's mind, restoring his strength almost instantly, in a way that looks a lot less like persuasion and a lot more like undoing a curse. Later, standing outside the Tower of Orthanc, Gandalf confronts Saruman directly, and with a single spoken command, shatters Saruman's wizard staff, stripping him of his authority and formally expelling him from the Order of Wizards in front of witnesses. That's not a small thing. That's one Maya asserting direct power over another. And then there's the Siege of Minas Tirith, where Gandalf stands alone at the broken gate of the city, facing down the Witch King of Angmar, the most powerful of the Nazgul, and the sheer presence radiating off him is enough to make even that creature hesitate, even if the confrontation gets cut short by the horns of Rohan arriving in the distance. None of that behavior lines up with the version of Gandalf who spent decades quietly wandering the Shire smoking a pipe. The white robes were never really the point. What actually changed was permission. There's actually a small but telling exchange that backs this up directly. When Gandalf the White meets Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli again in Fangorn Forest, they don't immediately recognize him. And for a moment, they even suspect he might be Saruman in disguise. When he finally identifies himself, he tells them plainly that Saruman, as he was, is now finished, and that he himself has effectively taken Saruman's old place at the head of the Order, minus the corruption. Gandalf the Grey, he says, was sent back because his task wasn't complete. Gandalf the White is what came out of the other side of that. It's less a promotion and more an unlocking, the difference between a spirit deliberately holding itself back and that same spirit finally being allowed to act at full strength because the danger facing the world had grown past the point where restraint still made sense. So, if his real power was always hidden underneath the shape of an old man, that raises another question. Could that shape itself ever actually change? Turns out, yes, and it happened more than once. Change in form. The Maiar, as a category of spirit, were originally capable of taking on physical shape whenever they wanted, back in the earlier ages of the world. Sauron himself did this constantly before his defeat at the end of the Second Age. Melian, another Maia, took the form of an elf queen and lived among the elves for centuries, but the Istari specifically agreed to give that flexibility up. Once they took the shape of old men to walk through Middle-earth, they were bound to stay in that form for the entire length of their mission. No shapeshifting allowed. But there's one documented exception, and it's the same event we already touched on. After the fall from the bridge, after the drawn-out fight through the underground lake and up the mountain, Gandalf's body dies completely. For a stretch of time after that, he exists without any physical form at all. The text describes him as sent out naked, drifting somewhere beyond the normal boundaries of the world, before a giant eagle named Gwaihir eventually finds him lying on the mountaintop and carries him down to recover in the forest of Lothlorien. There's also a bigger comparison worth making here. Sauron's entire existence eventually became tied to one specific physical form and to the object he poured a piece of himself into. When that object gets destroyed at the end of the story, Sauron doesn't get a second chance the way Gandalf did. His spirit is broken along with it, permanently. Gandalf's connection to a body was never built the same way, because his purpose in Middle-earth was never about dominating through that form, it was about guidance. That's likely a big part of why he could be sent back at all. It's also worth noticing what didn't change. Even after coming back whiter, taller, and visibly stronger, Gandalf still chooses to walk everywhere, still eats and sleeps among the other members of the Fellowship, still carries a staff and rides a horse instead of simply willing himself from place to place. The form might have shifted, but he never abandons the basic limitations that come with wearing a body in the first place. That restraint is deliberate. Even at his most powerful, he still holds himself to roughly the same rules everyone traveling with him has to follow. Now that we know his form can literally collapse and be rebuilt from nothing, let's actually get into what he does with that form while he's here. And we're going to start with something people constantly underestimate: fire. Pyrokinesis. Fire shows up around Gandalf constantly throughout the story, and it's easy to write it off as just flashy decoration, but the text treats it as a real controlled ability tied directly to who he is. Start with something that seems harmless on the surface, the fireworks at Bilbo's birthday party in the Shire. The book doesn't describe these the way you describe modern fireworks. It describes dragons made of colored fire that roar and swoop low over the crowd, trailing smoke and thunder, terrifying and delighting the hobbits at the same time. It's written less like a clever bit of engineering and more like actual magic on display, just used for fun instead of combat. Then there's the moment on the mountain pass of Caradhras, when the Fellowship gets trapped in freezing weather, unable to find dry wood, at real risk of dying from the cold. Gandalf takes wet pine cones, useless as kindling under normal conditions, and lights them instantly with a spoken command in Elvish, calling out, "Nar on Edraith Amen," meaning fire for the saving of us. A tongue of flame appears immediately from wood that shouldn't be able to burn. He even mentions afterward that doing this out in the open is genuinely risky, because it's the kind of display that draws unwanted attention from things watching the mountain. Earlier in the story, during the events told in The Hobbit, Gandalf uses fire as an actual weapon while the company is trapped up in trees, surrounded by wargs, wolf-like creatures working alongside goblins. He starts hurling blazing pine cones down to the pack like grenades, setting the animals and the ground around them on fire, turning what should have been a slaughter into a chance to escape. And running through nearly every underground scene in that story, his staff itself produces steady light on command, bright enough to cut through total darkness deep beneath the mountain, described at one point as shining like a shaft of pale, cold starlight, strong enough to hold back whatever's lurking in the dark around it. What's consistent across all these moments is that this fire never gets used for pure destruction. It's a tool tied specifically to his role as something standing against darkness, not a weapon of conquest the way a dragon's fire or a Balrog's fire would be. Fire is one weapon in his collection, sure, but when it actually comes down to a direct magical confrontation, Gandalf plays a completely different kind of game. Combative spells. There's a scene deep in the mines of Moria, inside a chamber called the Chamber of Mazarbul, where the Fellowship is being hunted, and Gandalf tries to seal a door shut using a spoken binding spell to buy them time. Something on the other side contests it directly. He describes feeling it nearly overpower him, almost pulling him bodily through the door. It's one of the only moments in the entire story where Gandalf openly admits real fear during a magical confrontation, and the sheer force pressing against his spell tells you something dangerous and unnamed is on the other side of that door. Then there's the fight on the bridge, which isn't just swordplay, even though he does draw his sword Glamdring and physically strikes with his staff. It's described as a genuine contest of power between two ancient spirits, ending when he shatters the bridge itself out from under the creature with a final blow. The confrontation with Saruman at Orthanc works the same way. Breaking another wizard's staff isn't a physical action, it's a spoken command backed by real authority, stripping power away instantly and visibly, in front of an audience that includes Saruman's own followers. And there's one more moment that's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention. After the young hobbit Pippin secretly looks into a magical seeing stone called a Palantir and nearly gets pulled into direct contact with Sauron's mind, Gandalf reacts immediately, before anyone even explains what happened, and pulls Pippin's consciousness back from that grip. It's implied afterward that Sauron himself briefly senses Gandalf's presence in that exchange and hesitates, unsure exactly what he's dealing with. There's also an earlier, smaller example that a lot of readers skip right past. Back in the Shire, at the very start of the story, when Gandalf explains to Frodo how Gollum was captured and questioned, he mentions that Aragorn tracked Gollum down through sheer effort and skill, while getting anything useful out of the creature once caught took something closer to a battle of wills than a conversation. Gollum doesn't give up the truth about the ring easily, and it takes real pressure, applied carefully, to pull the location of the Shire and the name Baggins out of him. It's a much quieter scene than the bridge or the tower, but it's the same underlying ability at work, someone forcing a resistant mind to yield. That last moment, physically reaching into someone's mind to pull them back from danger, isn't a one-time trick either. His connection to other minds runs a lot deeper through this entire story than most people ever notice. Telepathy. Tolkien actually wrote a separate piece of lore outside the main books, explaining that spirits like the Aenir can communicate directly, mind to mind, without needing spoken language at all. This concept, called Osanwe, is essentially thought sent and received silently between two minds that are willing to open themselves to each other. You can see this play out directly in the Palantir scene we just covered. Gandalf doesn't get told what happened to Pippin. He wakes up and moves before anyone has time to explain, already aware something has gone badly wrong. That's not intuition, that's him picking something up that nobody spoke out loud. There's also the way he interacts with other powerful minds across huge distances. Both Elrond and Galadriel are described as being in contact with him in ways that go beyond ordinary conversation, especially through Galadriel's connection to her mirror and her own mind at Lothlorien, where thought and counsel seem to move between the wise without anyone needing to send a letter or a messenger. Even his bond with Shadowfax, the great horse of Rohan, hints at this same thing. Shadowfax isn't controlled with reins or commands the way a normal horse would be. He responds to Gandalf almost instinctively, understanding him on a level that goes past training, closer to a kind of thought connection between the two of them than an actual rider and animal relationship. None of this is loud or flashy, it's quiet, background magic, and it explains a pattern that frustrates some readers, the way Gandalf always seems to just know things before anyone's told him. It's easy to write that off as convenient storytelling, but it's actually built directly into what kind of being he is. There's a flip side worth mentioning too. This same kind of mind-to-mind contact is exactly what makes Gandalf so difficult for Sauron to manipulate compared to someone like Saruman or Denethor, the Steward of Gondor. Both of those men fall under Sauron's influence at different points in the story, partly through direct or indirect contact using the same seeing stones. Gandalf actively avoids using a Palantir himself for most of the story, specifically because he understands how dangerous that kind of open channel can be for a mind less disciplined than his own. Knowing how to communicate silently with another spirit also means knowing exactly how a hostile mind could try to force its way in, and he treats that risk with a level of caution none of the moral characters fully grasp until it's too late for them. And speaking of knowing things before he's told, that's actually its own separate, much bigger ability, because Gandalf doesn't just pick up on things happening in the moment, he sees things coming long before they arrive. Precognition and insight. Decades before anyone else in the story understands what's really going on, Gandalf already suspects that the ring Bilbo picked up in a cave is something far more dangerous than a simple trinket that turns its wearer invisible. He spends years pushing Frodo to be careful with it, watching, waiting, gathering information, until he finally returns to Bag End and confirms the truth by holding the ring over a fire and reading a line of fiery script that only appears under heat, written in the black speech of Mordor. The moment he reads it, he understands exactly what they're dealing with, and he acts immediately, sending Frodo out of the Shire before it's too late. There's also his insistence, again and again, on sparing the life of Gollum, a creature everyone else in the story would have happily killed on sight. He tells Frodo directly that plenty of people who deserve to die are still walking around, and that judgment shouldn't be handed out in death too eagerly, because even Gollum might still have some part left to play before the end. That's not just a moral lesson about mercy. Given how the story actually ends, with Gollum's survival directly deciding the fate of the ring at Mount Doom, it plays out less like a guess and a lot more like genuine foresight. Long before the White Council or anyone else in the story grows suspicious of Saruman, Gandalf is already uneasy about him, quietly noticing things that don't add up about the head of his own order, watching him grow more distant and more focused on power for its own sake. And right at the very end of the story, standing at the Grey Havens as the last ship prepares to leave Middle-earth for good, Gandalf speaks about what comes after with a calm certainty that none of the mortal characters around him can match. The confidence of someone who has genuinely already seen past the edges of the world most people never get to look beyond. Even small throwaway lines earlier in the story hold up under scrutiny once you know how this ability works. His warning to Frodo that the ring will try to control the mind of whoever carries it for too long, his repeated insistence that the Fellowship take the longer, harder route rather than the fast one, and his refusal to ever take the ring for himself, even briefly, all read less like caution based on guesswork and more like decisions made by someone who's already glimpsed several ways this story could go wrong, and is actively steering events away from the worst outcomes whenever he gets the chance. Put all of that together, the immortal spirit underneath the disguise, the direct tie to the secret fire itself, the power that only fully unveils itself once his mission demands it, a form that can collapse and be rebuilt when needed, fire used as a precise and deliberate tool, spellwork strong enough to break another wizard's authority in a single sentence. a mind connected to other minds across entire distances, and an ability to see consequences long before anyone else in the room, and you start to understand exactly what Gandalf actually is. Arguably one of the most powerful beings who ever set foot in Middle-earth on the side of the good, and yet, for nearly the entire story, he chose to walk around looking like nothing more than a tired old man leaning on a wooden stick. If you made it this far, you clearly love this stuff as much as we do, so do us a favor and hit subscribe. Drop a like on your way out, and let us know in the comments which one of these powers surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next one.